Hi there, I'm Rob Caskey, proudly engaging in storytelling, and I'm hoping that you will follow me on Patreon and find these stories entertaining. I'm wanting today to share with you a little about a remarkable Norwegian Arctic explorer and statesman called Fridtjof Nansen. But before I do so, it would be fair to say that much of my experience to date has been in speaking to live audiences at conferences and dinners, and particularly on battlefields in various parts of my home country, South Africa. And I want to tell you that speaking to a camera where you have no reprieve and no feedback from a live audience is very, very difficult and challenging indeed. The Arctic is a remarkable place. It's an ocean surrounded really by continents and has within it 36,000 islands, the largest of which is Greenland. And Greenland is dominated by a massive ice cap, the second largest ice cap in the world behind Antarctica, the weight of which has pushed much of Greenland 3 kilometers below sea level. I was lucky enough first to visit the Arctic and Greenland on board an expedition ship with a German company called Hapag-Lloyd in 2014. And then last year, 2019, we were lucky enough to go back to Greenland and to sail the entire Northwest Passage with Abercrombie and Kent. Karen was fortunate enough to join me on that journey, the fabled Northwest Passage, trying to join the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans and find a shortcut between Europe and the spice-rich East. Now, Fridtjof Nansen is a remarkable human being. He was born into a family of some worth in 1861, tall, fit, hard individual, incredibly athletic. He, like so many of his countrymen, spent the summers camping and fishing and the winter skiing and sledding and hunting in the forests of their native Norway. I am always intrigued to tell our guests that, like Amundsen and his group of men who conquered the South Pole, most of these men were akin to Olympic quality skiers. As a young man, Fridtjof Nansen became the 1 mile ice skating champion of Norway, and he went on to be the cross-country skiing champion in Norway 11 years running, which I think should give you some indication of his tremendous ability as a skier and as an athlete. He clearly was a bright man. He studied various disciplines, but he was most interested in neurology. Having studied some of the small organisms in the marine system, he became incredibly interested in motor neuron transfer, ganglions, and neurology, and eventually became, in fact, a doctor of neurology, and is perhaps better remembered for that than he is for his Arctic exploration. But it would be fair to say that that great ice cap that dominates Greenland had been the source of intrigue for many explorers. And many had attempted to cross the ice cap from the west coast of Greenland across to the east coast of Greenland. Now this, Nansen felt, was a mistaken idea, because the west coast tends to be more temperate. The climate is much gentler than it is on the east coast. That is where most of Greenland's population live. And his argument was that if you set off from the west coast and get up onto the ice cap and you experience difficulties or things become tough, it's all too easy. The temptation is too strong to turn around and head back to safety, to warmth, to security, to civilization. And he wanted rather to attempt a crossing where you dropped off on the east coast, the inhospitable east coast of Greenland, and crossed the ice cap from east to west, his argument being that you always want to keep moving forward to safety, to warmth, to people, to security. And he selected a very, very special team to accompany him. There were 3 fellow Norwegians, all very accomplished skiers, and 2 Laplanders, 2 men of the Sami tribe, experienced outdoorsmen, fantastic skiers. And a ship called the Jason in 1888 took them all the way down the east coast of Greenland to a place called Sirmilik, where they planned to disembark the ship and take off in a northwesterly direction, 600 kilometers across Greenland to Disco Bay on the west coast. Well, when they got to Sermelik, having experienced terrible sea ice and some horrible storms, there'd been damage to the ship. Some of the railings around the ship had been damaged, and the Jason could not get all the way to the shore to drop off Nansen and his party of 5 with their boats and their sleds. So 10 miles offshore, Nansen made the decision to disembark the ship onto the ice. He hoped to move across the ice with his boats and his sleds to get to shore to begin his epic journey. Well, it wasn't to be. The ice proved too dangerous to try and cross the 10 miles between their disembarkation point and the coast. And they drifted southwards for a distance of 380 kilometers until they finally made landfall at a little place called Umuvik. Well, they decided that they immediately would have to retrace their steps up the coast, back up towards their initial starting point. Well, this proved extremely difficult. After 15 days of travel between the boats and their sleds, they made a distance of about 200 kilometers back up the east coast of Greenland to the original starting point, and decided that they were going to set off instead from Umuvik all the way across Greenland to Disco Bay. The crossing and the ascent up to 9,000 feet on the ice cap, practically the height of the top of our Drakensberg, proved incredibly difficult. And the team were delighted when Nansen made the decision, instead of proceeding northwesterly, to change his route due west and to head across to a place called Gotthard, some 450 kilometers away on the west coast of Greenland. Well, this epic crossing, successful as it was, took them 49 days. Eventually, they sailed in their little boats, sleds on board, using a tent as a sail down the fjord to Gotthard to learn that the last ship of the season, the one they were planning to catch back to Norway, had left without them. They were to spend 6 months with the wonderful, friendly Greenlanders before they were finally able to board a ship and find their way back to Norway, where they were fated as heroes. You can imagine now his reputation as an explorer began to grow on account of being the first man to successfully cross the ice cap of Greenland in 1888. Now, Nansen took great interest in the fact that on the north coast of Greenland there had been pieces of wood picked up from a ship called the Jeanette. Now, the Jeanette some years earlier had been crushed and destroyed by ice off the coast of Russia. And Nansen, as a result, was absolutely certain that everyone who was trying to get to the North Pole hitherto had largely attempted to go against this current that runs from east to west to try and get to the North Pole. And the fact that the Jeanette had been destroyed off the coast of Russia and pieces of the ship had been picked up on the north coast of Greenland, that everyone was to take a ship around to the coast of Russia and then wedge it into the ice. The movement of the ice and the current might in fact carry that ship to the North Pole and be the first to the North Pole. So this remarkable expedition would finally take place in 1895 on board a specially designed ship called the Fram, which in Norwegian means forward. This ship had been designed and built by a remarkable Scottish engineer called Colin Archer. It was an unusually shaped ship. It was 39 meters long and 11 meters wide. And you will immediately gather from those proportions that the ship did not fall into the normal proportions where a ship, for stability and comfort, needs to be 4 times its width or beam. So a 40-meter long ship should only have a beam of 10 meters. Ideally, that proportion needs to be closer to 5 or 6 times the width or beam of the ship to be really comfortable, to be sleek, to be effectively fast traveling across the oceans. But this ship would be quite different. The Fram was built to resemble half a boiled egg, incredibly wide and short. She had no sharp edges or ridges anywhere in her design that could be caught in the ice. And this ship was built incredibly strengthened and designed that if she were pinched in the ice, she would simply be pressed up out of the ice and rest on the ice, and then when the ice gave way, could right herself and sail onwards. Incredibly insulated, beautifully designed, not really designed for speed or comfort on the ocean, but designed to protect its men in the case of huge ice pressure. And Nansen and his team took off on the Fram all the way around on that route, first explored by Nordenskjöld in 1878, 1879. And they moved up to about 79 degrees, where they decided that they would enter the pack ice and have the ship, the Fram, jammed into the pack ice, which was duly executed. And the movement of the ice was very interesting. Some days it would move north, some days it would move south, but their movement towards the North Pole was incredibly slow. And Nansen, in desperation, eventually decided to take the last man who was selected for the team. And he was selected really as a dog driver, a man called Helmer Johansen. He was going to prepare to take Helmer Johansen, a team of dogs, specially designed boats and sleds, and to leave the Fram. And he was going to take off across the ice towards the North Pole, giving himself 50 days to try and make a dash to the North Pole, and then all the way back down to Franz Josef Land, where he hoped he would be able to find a ship to take him back to his homeland, Norway. Now, the preparations for this incredible journey were executed by Nansen and Johansen and the other men on board of the ship, and eventually they were ready to take off. After 2 false starts, they eventually left the Fram, heading northwards towards the North Pole. It would be fair to say that the ship was already in a position further north than anybody hitherto in history. Well, after 3 difficult weeks, Nansen and Helmer Johansen realized that the North Pole was beyond them. They were a full 3 degrees north of any earlier attempt to get to the North Pole, and they decided that they were going to turn around and head back south. They were at 86 degrees, 14 minutes north, 3 degrees, as I've said, further north than any attempt hitherto. And in their haste, and perhaps in the rush, these 2 tremendous explorers, dealing with breaking camp, dealing with the dogs, dealing with the sleds, they forgot an ominous moment to wind their chronometers, to wind their beloved watches. Now, this would immediately mean that they could not accurately calculate their longitude, and in so doing work out the direction of travel back towards Franz Josef Land. So Johansen and Nansen had to estimate their position, rewind their chronometers, take their readings with a sextant, and proceed onwards down across the ice towards Franz Josef Land. It was the most incredible of journeys. At one point, they were attacked, their little kayaks were attacked by walrus and badly damaged, and they had to pull their kayaks out onto the ice to try and effect a repair. At other times, they would use the sleds between the kayaks and create almost a raft and paddle along together over wide flows or stretches of water. On one occasion, they'd slaughtered a seal for some meat and were busy butchering the seal when both of their kayaks slipped off the ice into the water and began quickly to drift away. And Nansen realized immediately that if they lost the kayaks, it meant certain death. He might himself die diving into that freezing water, but he realized either way, death was certain. So he stripped off his heather Arctic clothing, dived into the water, and began to swim after the kayaks. Well, he felt immediately the effect of that freezing water, how his body was closing down, how the movements became more and more labored, slower and more difficult. And in a quite Herculean effort, he managed to catch up to one of the kayaks. But the difficulty of throwing his leg over and getting his body out of the water into the kayak was almost beyond him. He managed to get himself into that kayak, and paddled on to retrieve the second and paddled back to where Johansen was with the seal. Johansen said it was quite extraordinary to watch him strip off his clothing. He was pasty white underneath, but in reasonable condition. These Norwegians had mastered the correct diets for this sort of travel, and they set up a camp with a tent and set up their cooker to warm up the tent and to warm up Nansen. And Johansen said it was quite extraordinary. Within 12 hours, Nansen said he was as right as rain and ready to continue traveling. And they continued traveling till a huge flow of water prevented their onward travel, and they had to camp on the ice for a month. When the ice moved close enough together again, they proceeded with their travels and would eventually end up on the extreme northern end of Franz Josef Land with winter approaching. So Nansen decided not to carry on traveling south or to look for help, but in fact to prepare a hut to overwinter. And it is the most incredible part of the story, in my opinion. They were able to dig for themselves practically a base for a room about a meter into the snow and ice. They found a piece of wood that they used across the top of this hole, above which they placed some walrus skin as a roof and packed it with snow and ice. They had a little tunnel or passageway as an entry and exit point into this practically subterranean hut, and immediately began to cache as much meat as they could of surrounding walrus and seal. Now, I want you to imagine the challenges of inactivity. We're talking here about nearly 8 months that they would be forced to live in that hole in the ice to protect their hides from the attentions of polar bears. They had brought the hides into the hut, and with the warmth of the men and the warmth of the cooker, the hides and the meat on them were practically rotting continuously. So try and imagine the smell. They had cached meat outside in the ice in various caches, afraid of it being consumed by a polar bear, and on one occasion there was a loud sniffing and breathing at the end of the passageway. Johansen went to investigate, and dare I say it, in the mouth of their passageway was the huge head of a polar bear. Well, he withdrew immediately back into their hole, grabbed the rifle, came back down the passageway, and was able to shoot the polar bear. And as the polar bear collapsed, it began literally to vomit or regurgitate a huge amount of the meat and blubber it had consumed from one of their caches. Well, it would be fair to say that they managed to last the winter in that incredibly unpleasant hole in the ice. And when they finally emerged, winter becoming spring, they had not travelled far when Nansen heard the barking of a dog. And he was able to approach and eventually saw a figure walking towards him. It was none other than that of Fridtjof Nansen. Fridtjof Nansen had a camp. They were doing some scientific exploration and geological exploration on the far north of Franz Josef Land. And they were able, with a ship called the Windward, to bring Johansen and Nansen all the way back to Tromsø, where they were fortunate enough, do you know, within a week of arriving in Tromsø, the Fram arrived with all its men intact, having had the most incredible and successful voyage on the ice, but getting no further north than the point at which Nansen and Johansen had left the Fram earlier the previous year. Well, their return to Christiania, now Oslo, was simply sublime. They say there were crowds of 30 and 40,000 people lining the streets in the harbour, wanting to welcome back these great heroes who'd survived this incredible series of expeditions and mishaps and returned without losing a man back to Norway. Bearing in mind that at this time Nansen was very, very involved trying to secure the independence of Norway from Denmark and Sweden, an effort in which he was eventually successful. He had in the interim found himself a partner that he married. She sadly would pass away, and he would marry a second time. But Nansen was a man who, after the First World War and after the successful attempts on the South Pole, where Amundsen in fact had borrowed Colin Archer's ship, the Fram, for his journey down into Antarctica, took a tremendous interest in displaced individuals after the First World War. And after the forming of the League of Nations, for which Nansen became a delegate, he became extremely involved in trying to repatriate and resettle displaced individuals after the First World War. There were a huge number who were resettled in Lebanon and Syria. There were others who returned to various parts. But of course, there was this issue of identifying people. And Nansen created a document that became known as the Nansen Passport. It was originally intended really for Russian refugees, but really was appropriate for all folks all over Europe who were displaced and homeless after the First World War. And the Nansen Passport was eventually recognized by more than 50 countries and hugely advantageous in the resettling of displaced individuals after that mighty conflict. I'm intrigued to tell you that he would win the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts in resettling refugees and for his creation of the Nansen Passport. And when Nansen eventually passed away in 1930, the League of Nations created the Nansen Institute to continue with his work. Well, just before his death, he was violently outspoken about the fact that there were Russians starving in the Volga region of Russia, some 30 million Russians. And he was trying hard to lobby support, saying, we have huge unemployment after the First World War. We are burning surplus maize and corn in this country to provide fuel for the steam engines and the railway engines. We have our ships standing empty because there are no cargoes to be carried. And yet nobody is prepared to be moving food to these poor folks in the Volga region of Russia. Well, much of the West's attitude was that it was the Russians' own fault, and as a result of the Bolshevik system. But Nansen never forgave the West for their attitude towards these poor starving souls in the Volga region of Russia. And I am delighted to tell you that after his death and the continuation of his efforts in the form of the Nansen Institute, they once again won the Nobel Peace Prize for the repatriation and the resettling of refugees and his institute's tremendous humanitarian efforts in Europe. So here we have a remarkable human being, Fridtjof Nansen, who I think is often forgotten in terms of Antarctic and Arctic exploration, and a man whose reputation really went before him for his work in neurology, his work as an Arctic explorer, and then most importantly his humanitarian work as a delegate of the League of Nations. So I'm Rob Caskey, telling stories on Patreon. I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you will support me on this platform. Thank you very much for your engagement.